He was the man who would define the start of the 19th century. He has more documented victories than any other battlefield commander in history.
I guess one would think, in terms of people like Julius Caesar or Alexander. And I would say in many ways he's greater.
He's one of the most influential military leaders of all time.
Napoleon was exceptional in that he was genuinely loved by his men.
From a relatively humble background, he rose to become master of Europe.
For somebody like that to become emperor, ruler of the largest empire that Europe had seen, really, since the Middle Ages, is just amazing.
This is the rise of Napoleon.
This government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
Whether Russia has been provoked. What matters is that Russia has been wrong in its response.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation. Terror beseitigt sein, verwahren wir das Land!
Napoleon Bonaparte began his life in relatively modest circumstances. He was born on the 15th of August 1769 on the island of Corsica. France had only acquired the island from the Republic of Genoa the previous year, bringing it under French rule.
Prior to the French Revolution, Napoleon is someone who is essentially condemned to mediocrity. He comes from the minor gentry of a part of France which has only been incorporated into France shortly before his birth. His family are moderately influential on a local level.
He has a large number of siblings, a lot of outdoor activities, not a lot of luxury, a mother, Laetitia, who's very much down to earth, and a father who is involved in politics, but in many ways is a bit useless when it comes to things like, running the family finances, gambling, he leaves the family impoverished. So Carlo's probably not somebody that a young boy would necessarily look up to.
Carlo Bonaparte and his wife Laetitia, pregnant with Napoleon, had resisted the French takeover alongside the Corsican nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli. This, however, ultimately failed, and Carlo Bonaparte, reading the writing on the wall, decided to change tack.
The French, they take over Corsica. It takes them about a year to more or less assert their control. And Carlo Bonaparte, and by extension the Bonaparte family, they switch from being sort of pro-Paoli freedom fighters for Corsican independence to being collaborators. And I think that's something which troubles Napoleon as he grows up. But the French monarchy is very keen to integrate Corsica. So a great way of integrating any new territory is to get prominent families to send their sons either into the civil service or, in Napoleon's case, into the army.
He manages to become a military officer, but an artillery officer, which is not a particularly socially distinguished thing to be, because to be an artillery officer you have to know things, and knowing things is very lower class as far as the aristocracy are concerned. So in a world of France in the 1780s, which is highly aristocratic in its outlook, Napoleon is the kind of person who is really stewing his own ambitions in a society which is deeply hierarchical and isn't ever going to let someone like him ascend to greatness.
Napoleon, not satisfied with his position in the army, decided that instead he would return to Corsica. He was still a fervent believer in Corsican independence and sought out Pasquale Paoli, the leader of Corsican nationalism.
Napoleon goes back to Corsica, but he's not welcomed by Paoli. He hero worships Paoli, but Paoli, I guess, possibly that sort of Corsican clan mentality says, you're a Bonaparte, you're a collaborator, I don't really trust you. So he gets really cold shoulder. And I think that's quite devastating for what, he's a teenager at this point, to be kind of like just rejected there by his hero. It's quite clear that the Bonapartes, haven't got a great future in Corsica. Napoleon is ultimately a pragmatist. If you want to make a career, if you want a future, if you want to do something big, you do it via the French route. Corsica isn't going to get you anywhere because Paoli is that sort of buffer, he's that roadblock.
What Napoleon needed would be a world-shaking political and societal upheaval that would remove the existing system of power and enable him to rise rapidly through the ranks of the French military. As it turned out, he would get his wish. The people of France were rising up, disillusioned with their out-of-touch monarchy. France was going to revolution.
So the revolution of 1789 has some really deep roots. It's rooted in the dysfunction of the French monarchy, its inability to fund its ambitions to be a world power while having a very hierarchical internal social structure where being rich and powerful essentially means that you don't have to pay very much tax. And this comes to a tremendous climax in the 1780s, ironically after the French have been on the winning side of the War for American Independence. But they've built up such an enormous burden of state debt by that point that their rickety tax collecting mechanisms just cannot cope anymore.
The only way of reforming the tax system is to reform the entire structure, the political and social structure of France. And it's, you know, I suppose an analogy I would use is it's like if you're picking at a woolen sweater. If you start pulling at that thread, the whole thing unravels.
So the French Revolution starts out with tremendous optimism. It starts out with the belief that huge changes can be effected in society. But it also starts out with fear and paranoia and conspiracies. The reason why the Parisians stormed the Bastille on the 14th of July is that 3 days earlier, the king's brothers and other high-ranking aristocrats had sacked the reformist government and were trying to do away with the changes that had already been pushed through. And after July of 1789, the National Assembly that's been gathered together spends 2 years trying to put together a monarchical constitution, to have Louis XVI on the throne, to have political participation, to have rights, to have everyone paying their taxes and everything be good and great. But it continually runs into deeper and deeper problems and crises. That Enlightenment rationalism that told people they could make reform, it also tells them they can reform the Catholic Church, for example. But trying to reform the Catholic Church runs into the opinion of the upper echelons of society. And this is one of the profound chasms that opens up within French society. So by 1791, 1792, you have a state really of latent civil war. All these tensions that have been brought out through the previous 3 years are still brewing.
At the centre of this civil war were the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre.
Well, the Jacobins are Republicans, and they are Republicans of a sort of radical bent. These are people who wanted the execution of Louis XVI, and they are looking really for a very profound political transformation of France. They don't just want a sort of change at the top, but keeping the existing system pretty much as is. They're very happy to use kind of violence and terror to push the revolution forward.
The Jacobins had a strong influence on Napoleon, and when he returned to France and rejoined his regiment in Nice in June 1793, he wrote an account expressing his support for the radical Republican group. Not long after, perhaps as a result of this pro-Jacobin writing, Napoleon was given his first big opportunity. He was called upon to lead the French artillery as the Republican forces laid siege to the strategic port city of Toulon.
It's a natural harbour. To this day it remains the main port of the French Mediterranean fleet. It is so in 1793. So strategically immensely important for France. About a third of its fleet is stationed there in this period. The trouble is, from a French revolutionary perspective, is it's full of royalists. It's full of people that don't like where France is heading politically. So they surrender the city to an allied force, not just a British force, but Spanish and Savoyards as well, who occupy that major strategic point, which then the French revolutionary forces, of which the young Napoleon Bonaparte is part, they then besiege.
And this is where Bonaparte really steps onto the stage. As an artillery officer, he comes up with a plan to take one of the forts surrounding Toulon, which has been resisting capture. But if they can take the fort, they'll then be able to dominate the city and the port with their artillery, and their enemy's position will become untenable. So he puts this forward particularly to a civilian politician called Barras, who himself is a nobleman by descent, but is one of these radical Jacobin representatives. And Napoleon is allowed to put this plan into action, and it succeeds.
Napoleon's contribution during the siege of Toulon earned the 24-year-old artillery officer a promotion to the rank of brigadier general. However, all was not so simple. The tide in France was turning, and the people were rising up again. This time against the Jacobins, whose reign of terror was coming to an end. The newly promoted General Bonaparte, whose connections to the Jacobins had helped him reach this position, now found himself on rocky ground.
The Jacobins, of course, didn't last. They'd tried to promote the idea of the Republic, and in doing so, put to death about 40,000 of their enemies. And people naturally became extremely suspicious that they were going to be the next.
Being a sort of professional soldier is a bit dangerous in the French army in this period, because regimes come and go in Paris with an ever-growing kind of rapidity. So if you tie yourself to a particular regime, that regime at some point is more than likely going to collapse, and your career, possibly your life, might collapse along with it. And Napoleon is associated with the Jacobins. He's published a pamphlet which gets him some note from Maximilien Robespierre's brother. And so when the Committee of Public Safety under Maximilien Robespierre is overthrown in the coup of Thermidor, Napoleon is almost dragged down with that regime. He's not dragged to his death, but it does put his career on hold, and his meteoric rise is stopped for a period.
The Thermidorian reaction, as it became known, introduced a new regime that hoped to bring together the now fractured left and right-wing politicians. But achieving this was easier said than done.
After the fall of Robespierre in July of 1794, the survivors of the terror spend the next year really deciding how to put France back together again, dealing with impulses towards revenge from both the left and the right. So these Thermidorians drift back towards a political centre, which is therefore always more right-wing than some of the other surviving Jacobins would like, but clearly much more left-wing than a lot of surviving royalists would like. And royalism itself comes to express a whole spectrum of opinions, from absolute counter-revolutionaries who would hang everyone, through to people who start thinking, well, maybe a constitutional monarchy wasn't such a bad idea since we've mucked up having a republic. But all this is kind of stewing in a mix through into 1795, when these Thermidorians decide to have a new constitution. It provokes what is always referred to as a royalist uprising from the western districts of Paris.
For Napoleon, this uprising offered him a shot at redemption in the eyes of the French government.
Barras, who is the chief politician in Paris at the time, picks on Napoleon to have a role in combating the royalist plot, not necessarily because he thought Napoleon was a great guy, but because of the memory of Toulon and what Napoleon had been able to do there.
And Napoleon Bonaparte, who is a junior general at this point, with help, manages to again get some artillery. Somebody who's going to be very important in Napoleon's later career as it develops, Murat. He's a cavalry commander, the 12th Chasseurs à Cheval. He's ordered by Napoleon Bonaparte to seize some nearby artillery. And that artillery is then deployed very ruthlessly using grape shot, which are essentially sort of musket balls and sort of bits of metal fragment. And these are fired from the artillery into a mass of royalist insurgents and, coup attempt over. And you've got a very grateful French Republican government, which, if you like, owes Napoleon one.
With a whiff of grape shot, Napoleon became a household name, winning him favour with the Directory, the new power in France, who reinstated the 26-year-old as Brigadier General and gave him his first real command, the Army of Italy. But before he embarked on his first campaign, Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, marrying her in a ceremony on the 9th of March 1796. Josephine was a widow whose husband had been executed during the Reign of Terror.
Josephine is older than Napoleon. She's very much a kind of part of the inset in this regime which is known as the Directory. It's a regime which has become associated with corruption, both financial and moral. And Josephine is elegant, charming, and Napoleon is, by all accounts, smitten by her. I suppose what is significant is that she is connected to the high echelons of the French regime, notably somebody called Barras, who's within the directorial government. And you need that sort of connection really for your career to progress. And this is just, of course, on the eve of possibly the most important breakthrough in Napoleon's career, which is his appointment as commanding general of the Army of Italy.
So the Army of Italy is relatively small, 30,000 men, poorly supplied, neglected really compared to some of the other fronts on which there's been more fighting over the last year or two. Armies in the north have been winning some great victories in 1795. So Napoleon goes to this army and presents himself in a sense as their saviour, that he is the man who is going to lead them on to greater things. He famously says to them that you're here and you've got nothing, you've got no boots, you've got no money, you've got no food. There is Italy. It's full of wealth, and we're going to go and get it, and it'll be glory for you, glory for us, glory for me. And that's very much the spirit that he takes into the campaign. There is a kind of freebooting, almost piratical mixture of motives, but at the same time it's also about France and glory and representing a wider ideal.
His enemy was the Austrian Empire, whose forces vastly outnumbered his own. Not one to be intimidated by the task ahead of him, Napoleon immediately went on the offensive.
He moves fast. He often moves unexpectedly as far as the enemy is concerned. So there's that vigour, which often is missing on the Austrian side. You follow through. He's got that great eye for geography. He can see where to advance, where to cut off enemy supplies, where to make the enemy feel that they can't retreat if they need to along their own supply lines. Napoleonic warfare, which really starts in this period, is characterized by rapid movement.
And in Italy, through 1796 into 97, he consistently outmaneuvers the Austrian enemy, pushes them out of a whole range of different territories.
And the Austrians, by the autumn of 1797, sort of throw in the towel. It's made easy for them in that Napoleon Bonaparte, again, acts pragmatically and does a trade with them. So the Austrians actually receive Venice in return for territories which they're forced to give up, in effect, to France. And I think what is significant there from the point of view of Napoleon's career is that he's starting to act as a statesman as well as a soldier. He is making high-level geopolitical decisions without much reference to the government in Paris, it might be said. They have to basically accept what he signs up to.
Napoleon's a great battlefield leader. He's a great military leader in the narrow sense. What he also starts to show during the years in Italy is his very strong conviction of himself as being entitled to be a political leader as well, of being entitled to be treated almost as a monarch. And while he's there in Milan, he bases himself in what is effectively a palace, and actually enlarges it and has big marquees put up in the gardens of the palace so that more people can come and pay court to him, so that it becomes the kind of place where you have to come if you want anything from the French authorities, and present yourself to Bonaparte, who is sitting there in a throne room waiting to have these audiences with you. And he sets himself up like that very clearly. And then when he goes back to Paris at the end of 1797, he very carefully leaves all that behind. And he goes into Paris in an ordinary coach, dressed in civilian clothes, and presents himself very humbly to his political masters, because he's playing both sides against the middle. He likes being in charge, being the unquestioned leader and ruler, but he knows that if he's not careful, he'll just get chucked in prison. So he is playing a game of power very clearly from these days in Italy onwards.
Napoleon returned to Paris a hero. The 28-year-old had defeated the Austrian Empire, all while more experienced French generals had made little ground in the northern battlefields of Germany. Now it was time to turn his attention to France's greatest enemy, the British. But rather than confronting this northern foe with a direct attack, he looked to the east.
The idea of looking eastward, looking to the Levant for some kind of strategic advantage is not unusual. It's been part of French long-term strategic thinking. What they're looking at by 1798, it's an interesting amalgam of ideas. One is that the confrontation with Britain to the northwest has really ground to a stalemate, and they're looking around for another way to kind of break out of that sort of simple army versus navy dichotomy they've got there.
The Mediterranean, of course, is much more difficult, at least theoretically, for the British Navy to operate in.
Napoleon persuades the politicians in Paris, who are easily persuaded because, after all, Napoleon by now is rather popular. He's extremely good at publicity and organising publicity and organising networks of influence. And he is spoken of as someone who ought to have more of a political role in Paris, which the politicians, of course, the Directory, don't want to know.
And so Napoleon was allowed to set off for Egypt, following in the footsteps of two of his greatest idols from antiquity.
For Napoleon, he's going to be operating in this sort of exotic place where Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great have been conquerors. You can see how it's going to trigger the imagination of Napoleon.
Napoleon wants to go to the east because, as he said, the east is where all great glory comes from. And he very clearly wants great glory. It's not about what he can do for other people. It is very much clearly about what he can do for himself to become greater. And he'll take to Egypt both, obviously, his military force and also this remarkable scientific force that he puts together, several dozens, hundreds of scientists and their associates who will found something called the Institute of Egypt, paralleling the National Institute of Sciences, which has been set up in Paris.
They're going to investigate Egypt as a source of economic power, as a source of raw material, as well as somewhere where the French can get more influence going east towards India. They're going to Egypt, which has been most recently, of course, part of a Muslim empire, with a language which they didn't know. Almost no one on those boats going to Egypt had any knowledge of Arabic. And what knowledge they had was classical Arabic. And what they'd given to inform them about Egypt was what they'd read when they were students, which was Herodotus and his absolutely brilliant account of the society and culture of ancient Egypt.
Most of them also are dual purpose, these intellectuals, so they do have a function with things like sort of military logistics and administration, but in the other half of their professional lives, they're taking sketches of these wonderful monuments which they see, of cataloguing, of collecting, and of discovering objects like the Rosetta Stone, and of in many ways creating that modern subject area of Egyptology. The Egyptians hadn't really seen a military expedition on this scale, certainly not the Egyptians who were alive at the time. It is a colossal military expedition in terms of number of ships and in terms of number of troops who the French bring over. So I think one could talk about shock and awe in the initial sort of phase. Napoleon makes all sorts of promises. He adopts language which he thinks will be appealing to Egyptians.
Looking at how Napoleon approaches the contemporary population of Egypt, there's also some very deeply negative aspects there. They go in with this very superior Enlightenment attitude that you can exploit Islam. You can lie to people and say that you're sympathetic to Islam, and then they will obey you. And particularly early on in the French occupation, there are some very cynical attempts to persuade the general population that French republicanism, because it's anti-Catholic, is pro-Islamic. And it is all entirely sort of superficial and cynical and manipulative. And it's also associated again with projecting Bonaparte as a kind of personal saviour, that he is somehow involved in this syncretic image they want to put forward, not just as the leader of the army, but as himself, as a leader whose personal qualities will bring good things to the Egyptians. But of course, in practice, as many people will find when they get occupied by a Napoleonic army, it is a question of looting and requisition and theft and physical abuse, and in the end, a thoroughly unpleasant occupation experience for the Egyptians.
But things quickly turned sour for Napoleon. Thinking he was out of reach of the British Royal Navy, he was caught off guard when Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile. In true Napoleonic fashion, the French general did not stay put for long, instead choosing to go on the offensive, hoping to meet the British-backed Ottomans who were marching towards him head-on.
The campaign which takes place ultimately is a failure for the French. They don't achieve their objective, which is to halt the Ottoman advance. But you do get a couple of episodes which are important for Napoleon's reputation. And one is the massacre of Ottoman prisoners, which is a dark episode even by the low standards of a period. It's controversial. And the other is where he is seen to heal and to sort of touch the plague victims. Plague is still rife in that part of the world in the late 18th century. And there's this very famous painting which shows Napoleon almost as a Christ-like figure, touching these people who are afflicted with plague. He's brave enough to do that. It's that sort of care which he shows for the ordinary French soldier, at least that reputation which he acquires, which makes him so popular amongst the ordinary French soldiers.
The Egyptian campaign was a failed campaign, militarily. But Napoleon managed to get himself and his close associates back to Paris quickly enough before the politicians in Paris realised it had been a failure.
What Napoleon does is abandon his army in Egypt. And that, again, is one of those turning points in his life that we have to acknowledge. He had no orders to return to France. His army had partly successfully, partly unsuccessfully expanded the area under control, but it was becoming clear to him that a stalemate was going to ensue. And he'd started to hear rumours that things were going on in France that might open up other possibilities for him. So in the middle of 1799, he is ironically welcomed back into France. All that they have heard is his propaganda about how wonderfully things were going in Egypt.
Rather than facing a firing squad, Napoleon received a hero's welcome upon his return to France, at a time when the country's political situation looked dire.
France is now confronting a new coalition of enemies, not only Britain and the Ottomans, but also the Russians and the Austrians again. So from a geopolitical standpoint, it's not rosy, and domestically the Directory is imploding. It's been sort of swinging from left to right, it's unstable. There's a group of politicians in France who say this has got to stop. We need to have a regime change, but we need to have a general. We need to have some military muscle to effect what is going to be a coup d'etat.
But these coup plotters, which come to be centred around the Abbé Sieyès, who is a sort of wonderfully genteel intellectual to find at the heart of a coup plot, who's been there since 1789 with, good but slightly overcomplicated ideas about how to run a country. He's still there in 1799, trying to find people who'll join him in actually overthrowing the Directory and imposing a more authoritarian solution. And this is the situation that Bonaparte steps into after they've considered various other military leaders. But once Bonaparte gets his feet under their table, he very clearly makes himself the leader of what is going to happen.
It doesn't quite go as planned, because Napoleon is not a great public speaker, and he might be good at haranguing his troops, but he's not very good at sort of functioning in a sort of parliamentary setting. So in effect he gets denounced as an outlaw, and the coup almost goes awry but for the intervention of his brother Lucien Bonaparte and of his troops, who protect him from what he claims is an assassination attempt, but is more a bit of spitting and jostling, and no worse than that.
And in the end, the whole thing is decided rather brutally by armed troops pushing these legislators out of the assembly where they've gathered and telling them it's all over now. There's no way back. And having physically, as it were, dissolved the legislature, the coup plotters are now in a position to think about what to put in its place.
Napoleon, now 30 years old, managed to seize power and declare himself First Consul. Supported by 2 other consuls, he now found himself at the head of the French state, a position that was soon confirmed by something completely new to France, a plebiscite.
The idea of every adult male, regardless of what tax they had paid, getting a vote sounded extremely revolutionary, extremely liberating, extremely egalitarian. But of course, the question that they're asked is actually very narrow. It's, are you going to take Napoleon, Cambara says, and Le Bon as 3 consuls, or are you not? There's no alternative. In addition, Napoleon's brother Louis, who did the counting in the plebiscites, manipulated the figures.
The thing is that this regime wants near unanimity. It wants to show that it's brought all French people together, that it's above faction. And you can't really show that if you simply get 51% of the vote as opposed to 49% of the vote. So that's, I think, the reason for the cheating. Not that you want to win, but that you want to show unanimity.
So the consulate presents itself very successfully as a peacemaking regime, as something that will pacify France. And there's different levels at which this is quite true. A lot of law and order has really broken down in the later 1790s. People no longer trust authority in terms of judicial procedures and so on. The army has already had to be used extensively for combating banditry and other kinds of unrest. So an openly authoritarian regime is quite widely accepted as something which will just stop the threats to property, the threats to individual security, the bloody vendettas which have been raging around the country through the 1790s. And a thoroughly well-organised military effort to suppress all that kind of problem is very successful in the years after 1799.
What people wanted was security and stability and an end to civil war, and along with that, a legal and judicial system that would work. And the reform has been talked about, reform has been discussed, but nothing completed. And it was under Napoleon as First Consul that Napoleon promoted, first of all, a new judicial structure which was centralized on Paris, where judges were appointed directly by the Minister of Justice in Paris, and a codification of the laws, which had been endlessly debated but not completed.
Napoleon will negotiate a so-called concordat with the papacy. He'll negotiate a return to an essentially collaborative relationship with the Catholic Church, ending the most deep-seated conflict which has dogged the 1790s, while at the same time not having to give the Catholic Church back any of its money. It's a very good deal for France in that respect, and it's an even better deal for France because Napoleon adds some additional articles to the document after the Catholic Church has left. So that he says they've got more out of it than the Catholic Church knew they were giving away. But that again is a typically Napoleonic move.
The Napoleonic regime is more conservative, and it starts to talk about reinstituting old institutions which help preserve a kind of stable France. And that means a kind of a patriarchal system, amongst other things. And that's bad news for those who had been arguing for things like the abolition of slavery, but also for equal rights for women.
Women, as a result of the Napoleonic Codes, have virtually no civil rights at all. They almost cease to exist as people. The father has total control over the children, over how they're to be brought up, where they're to be brought up, how they're to be educated and married. He makes those decisions. He even makes the decision where his wife is to live. And in theory, he could insist upon his wife accepting a mistress living in the same house. Women's status is noticeably reduced.
Napoleon was now the de facto ruler of France, but his hold on power was tenuous to say the least. Austria had reoccupied northern Italy and a French garrison was under siege in Genoa. Napoleon had to act, quickly and decisively. In order to secure his hold on France, he needed a swift victory over Austria. And so he followed in the footsteps of Hannibal and marched his army over the Alps.
Napoleon's crossing of the Alps is a sort of quintessentially Napoleonic action. It catches the Austrians by surprise. It means that the French have quickly positioned themselves in such a way that they threaten the Austrian lines of communication, back into Austria ultimately. So it forces the Austrian commander, somebody called Michael von Miller, to turn around and to head towards the French army, which he has to neutralize.
Napoleon met the Austrian forces for a single decisive battle near the town of Marengo.
Marengo starts off with an Austrian numerical advantage, something like 28,000 troops, outnumbering the French force under Napoleon Bonaparte, which is closer to 20,000 troops. Napoleon there has been caught by surprise. He's managed to surprise the Austrians by marching through the Alps, but on this occasion he doesn't believe that he is confronting the main Austrian force. And what Napoleon has been doing, perhaps unwisely, is spreading out his own troops to try and cover various sort of lines of communication. So he's dispersed his forces. So the battle initially doesn't go very well for the French. They are forced to fall back. And so the Austrian commander is actually, he basically thinks he's won, and is sort of, actually he retreats himself to communicate that success back to his superiors. But he's done it a little bit ahead of the close of play. The French managed to call up reinforcements. Napoleon throws in his consular guard and he plugs some gaps in the French line. And then you get the arrival of Desaix, who comes in at some crucial moment and really catches, I think, the Austrians, who really think they have won, by surprise and bundles them back to where they had started and inflicts, a substantial number of casualties on the Austrian side in terms of killed, wounded, but above all captured. So that really wrecks the Austrian army.
Napoleon is again saved from possible defeat by General Desaix, who storms onto the battlefield of Marengo and gets himself killed in saving the day, enabling Bonaparte to claim all the credit. France will find itself by 1801 able to be at peace able even to bring the British to the peace table for the first time in this whole period, because the British now have no continental allies, no sense of how they could prosecute the war any further. And so the Peace of Amiens is initially agreed in late 1801 and formally signed in 1802. And for the next year or so, Napoleon really does appear as the peacemaker of Europe. He's established a settlement where France is as dominant as a nation might want to be in that sphere of Western Europe. But it will turn out to be only a pause in the larger military story.
As a consequence, the regime becomes increasingly secure, which no regime has been since 1789. It's important to realise that this is 3 years of relative stability compared with the previous years. And so Napoleon then risks a new plebiscite, which makes him consul for life, which again, there's a victory of about 3 million yeses and a few thousand noes.
He was never going to lose any of these votes. It's simply a question of deciding how much he wants to win them by. And this is a pattern that carries forth from the life consulate into his nomination as emperor, which will happen a year after the war has restarted.
The argument which Napoleon uses and his supporters say that you take out Napoleon, for an assassin's bullet or a bomb, and there are assassination attempts, several against Napoleon in this period. The only way of stopping that is to create a hereditary system where it doesn't really matter if you take out Napoleon because you've got a clear line of succession.
Undoubtedly, to be proclaimed emperor was going to be the top, and particularly for a nation of men educated in the classics. To have an emperor was better than to have a consul.
And that is ratified by plebiscite in the spring of 1804, leading to the famous coronation at the beginning of December, where Napoleon very famously crowns himself, that he would not give up to anyone else the right to put the crown on his head. So he takes it from the hands of the Pope and puts it on his own head. And at that point, crystallised in a very deliberate propagandistic choice, you can see exactly who Napoleon Bonaparte thought he was.
Napoleon knew his history, and he knows the story of Charlemagne, who had been crowned by the Pope on Christmas Day, 800. And of course, that relationship implies that the Emperor of the West owes his authority and legitimacy to the Church as a mediator between God and the secular power. And Napoleon doesn't really want to give that kind of impression.
In just 10 years, Napoleon Bonaparte went from an unknown artillery officer to the emperor of the largest empire Europe had seen in 1,000 years. His ambition did not stop there, and would see Europe through an almost constant state of war for the next decade, an era aptly named the Napoleonic Wars.
Napoleon had the opportunity, as he'd had the opportunity before, to sit back into being a great power. But the future would prove that was never enough for him.
There's always more to strive for, and he, of course, after 1804, embarks upon the greater part of his territorial conquests. Conquests which will take him to Spain after 1808 and to Russia in 1812. It's a regime ultimately founded upon not democracy but military victory, and you really need to supply military victory after military victory, and of course that means really a route to conquest without limit.
Although Napoleon's military successes ultimately faltered, and his mastery over Europe proved to be short-lived, his legacy has endured to this day.
If you look at France, it's really under Napoleon's direction and encouragement that the institutions of modern France are really created. Its creation is promoted, right down to all the codes of law. In every direction, you can say, there is Napoleon's hand.